The morning started as calm and peaceful as it could be. General Ava Harris, one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Army, decided to take her usual morning jog in the nearby park. The park was a place she loved. Open fields, tall trees, and a quiet path that let her clear her mind from the stress of her responsibilities. Dressed in her standard jogging gear, she looked like any other civilian enjoying a run, though her posture and stride still carried the disciplined air of her military training. Ava had always been admired for her strength and focus. She had dedicated her life to serving her country, earning the respect of those who knew her. But despite her achievements, she was humble and approachable, always stopping to greet people she met during her runs. Today, though, the park felt unusually quiet. There weren't many people around, and the usual chatter of families and children was missing. As Ava jogged through one of the quieter trails, she heard barking in the distance. She paused, wiping the sweat from her brow, and looked in the direction of the sound. It was getting louder, closer. Moments later, 2 police officers emerged from the trees, each holding the leash of a large K-9 unit. The dogs barked aggressively, pulling against their handlers as if chasing something unseen. "Good morning," Ava said politely as she moved to the side of the path to let them pass. She had a natural respect for law enforcement, knowing their roles were as demanding as her own. The officers, however, barely acknowledged her presence. One of them, Officer Craig Miller, gave her a quick glance, his face tightening. He was a new addition to the town's police force, and known for his strict demeanor. The barking dogs seemed to heighten his tension. As Ava resumed her jog, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The barking grew louder behind her, and when she turned to look, she saw one of the K-9 dogs had broken free from its handler. It charged toward her with alarming speed, teeth bared and eyes locked on her. "Control your dog," Ava shouted, her military training kicking in. She held her ground, her hands raised to show she wasn't a threat. But the dog didn't stop. The officer shouted commands, but it was too late. The dog lunged at Ava, knocking her to the ground. She tried to protect herself, using her arms to shield her face, but the dog's strength was overwhelming. The other officer finally arrived, pulling the dog away, but the damage had already been done. Ava lay on the ground, blood staining her jogging clothes and the grass beneath her. Her breaths were shallow, and her vision blurred. "Call an ambulance," shouted Officer Miller, his voice shaking. In the chaos, Ava's phone, which had fallen from her pocket, buzzed with an incoming call. The screen flashed with the name Dad. It was a name that carried weight. Her father, Samuel Harris, was not just her protector, but a senior agent in the FBI. As the officers scrambled to control the situation, they had no idea that the person they had just failed to protect had a powerful advocate who would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. The quiet park was now the center of a storm that was only beginning to unfold. Samuel Harris was at his desk in the FBI headquarters when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, expecting a casual check-in from his daughter, Ava. Instead, it was a call from an unknown number. He picked up, his instincts sharpening. "Mr. Harris," a nervous voice said on the other end. "This is Officer Craig Miller from the City Police Department. There's been an incident involving your daughter, General Ava Harris." The world seemed to stop for Samuel. "What happened to her?" His voice was calm, but the underlying edge of urgency made the officer pause. "She's been attacked by one of our K-9 units during a patrol in the park," Officer Miller stammered. "She's been taken to the hospital." I'm sorry." Samuel didn't wait for more details. "Which hospital?" he demanded, scribbling down the name before ending the call. Grabbing his jacket, Samuel informed his team that he was leaving for a personal emergency. His face betrayed none of the fear and worry flooding his mind, but inside, he was already bracing himself for the worst. As he drove to the hospital, Samuel replayed the conversation in his head. Ava was strong, disciplined, and smart. She knew how to handle herself in almost any situation, but even the best training couldn't always prevent accidents or recklessness. He clenched the steering wheel tighter, anger bubbling beneath the surface. An attack by a police K-9. It didn't make sense. At the hospital, Samuel rushed through the doors, quickly finding the emergency room. A nurse guided him to Ava's room, where she lay pale and still on the hospital bed. Bandages wrapped around her legs, and her uniform was folded neatly on a chair beside her. The sight of her, always so strong and confident, now looking so vulnerable, hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. "Dad." Ava's voice was faint but steady. Her eyes opened slightly, meeting his. She tried to sit up, but he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Don't move," he said softly, his voice breaking just a little. "I'm here. You're safe now." Ava gave him a weak smile. "It wasn't the dog's fault," she whispered. The officer lost control. Samuel's jaw tightened. "We'll deal with that later. Right now, you focus on getting better." A doctor entered the room, explaining Ava's condition. While the injuries were severe, she was expected to recover fully with time. Samuel nodded, thanking the doctor, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. He knew the situation was far from over. Outside the hospital room, Samuel called his assistant. "I need every detail about the officers involved in this incident," he said firmly. "Find out who handled the K-9 unit, their records, and if there have been any previous complaints." "Yes, sir," the assistant replied, sensing the urgency. Samuel returned to Ava's side, holding her hand. "Rest, Ava. I'll take care of everything." "I know you will, Dad," she said softly, her eyes closing again. As Samuel sat by her bedside, his mind raced with questions. Why had this happened? Was it negligence or something worse? He was determined to find out, and to hold anyone responsible accountable. For now, all he could do was wait, but he knew the storm brewing inside him would soon be unleashed. This wasn't just about Ava. It was about ensuring no one else would suffer the same fate. The next morning, Samuel stood in the hospital's waiting room, his mind sharp and focused. Ava was still resting, but he couldn't sit still. Her recovery was important, but the incident, how a police K-9 had attacked his daughter, was far from over. This was only the beginning of something much bigger. Samuel had spent years investigating cases as an FBI agent. He had seen many crimes, uncovered many secrets, but something about this case felt different. It wasn't just a random attack. Ava wasn't just a soldier. She was his daughter, and someone had to be held accountable for what happened. After speaking briefly with Ava's doctor to check on her progress, Samuel made his first call. He reached out to his connections in law enforcement and began gathering information about the officers involved. Officer Craig Miller, the one who had called him earlier, seemed to be the one in charge of the K-9 unit during the incident. Samuel's instincts told him to look deeper into Miller's history. He asked for records on Miller's service and his involvement with the K-9 unit. As he spoke with various officials, he began to uncover some unsettling details. Officer Miller had been with the force for less than 2 years, and although he had a clean record, there were murmurs within the department about his handling of the K-9 unit. Several other officers mentioned that Miller had a tendency to act hastily when under pressure, and there were a few minor incidents with the dogs that had been brushed under the rug. Why wasn't this looked into before? Samuel muttered to himself, frustration building. But he didn't have time for frustration. He had a mission, and nothing was going to stop him from finding the truth. As he sat at a small table in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, he called his assistant again. "Get me everything you can about Officer Miller. I want his full service record. And look into the K-9 program, how it's managed, and if there have been any other incidents like this." His assistant assured him they were already on it, but Samuel couldn't wait. He knew he had to act fast. The longer this situation stayed in the shadows, the more difficult it would be to get justice for Ava. Back at the hospital, Ava was awake, her pain medication easing her discomfort, but she was still deeply shaken. Samuel returned to her side, and as she looked up at him, he could see the worry in her eyes. "Dad," She whispered, her voice steady but weak. Is everything going to be okay? What happens now? Samuel smiled gently, brushing a lock of hair from her face. We're going to make sure everything's all right. He reassured her. I've already started gathering information. We'll get to the bottom of this. Ava nodded, but she still seemed troubled. I don't want this to turn into something bigger, Dad. I don't want anyone else getting hurt. I understand, Samuel replied, his tone filled with understanding. But if we don't speak up now, it could happen again, to someone else, and we can't let that happen. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She trusted her father completely. She had always seen him as a pillar of strength, someone who could make things right. If anyone could turn this around, it was him. Thank you, Dad, Ava said softly. I know you'll fix this. Samuel leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss on her forehead. You don't have to thank me. We're in this together, always. As he stood up to leave her room, he felt a deep sense of determination. He knew the path ahead would be challenging, but he wasn't going to back down. He would use every resource at his disposal to uncover the truth. And this time, no one was going to hide behind excuses. The investigation had only just begun, but Samuel Harris was determined to bring justice for his daughter. Samuel Harris sat at his desk, poring over documents his assistant had managed to gather. Reports about the K-9 unit and Officer Craig Miller painted a troubling picture. Complaints about the dog's behavior had been filed by several civilians, but they had been dismissed as misunderstandings or minor incidents. No proper investigation had ever taken place. Samuel leaned back in his chair, frustration simmering. He knew this wasn't just about one officer or one dog. This was about a system that had allowed negligence to thrive. As an FBI agent, Samuel had seen similar patterns before. Complacency, poor training, and a lack of accountability leading to preventable harm. He picked up his phone and called Lisa, his assistant. Lisa, I need you to dig deeper into the department's K-9 program. Find out who's in charge of training and what protocols are in place or not in place, and get me the names of anyone else who's filed a complaint. Yes, sir, Lisa replied. I'll send over everything I can find. Later that day, Samuel visited the park where Ava had been attacked. He met with a few witnesses who had seen the incident unfold. One man, a jogger named Mark, described how chaotic the scene had been. The dog came out of nowhere, Mark said, shaking his head. It wasn't responding to the officer's commands at all. Your daughter didn't do anything to provoke it. She was just jogging. Another witness, a young mother who had been at the park with her children, added, it was terrifying. She was so calm, even when the dog lunged at her. But the officer, he looked like he didn't know what to do. Samuel thanked them for their time and noted their statements carefully. Each account added weight to the evidence he was building. This wasn't just about one dog breaking free. It was a failure of training and preparation. When Samuel returned to the hospital, he found Ava sitting up in bed, flipping through a book. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a tired smile. Busy day? She asked. You could say that, Samuel replied, sitting beside her. I spoke to some witnesses. Their stories match up. This wasn't an accident. It was negligence. Ava sighed, setting her book aside. I don't want this to become a witch hunt, Dad. I just want people to be safe. Samuel reached over and took her hand. That's exactly why I'm doing this. It's not about punishing one person. It's about fixing the system that let this happen. If we don't push for change, it'll happen again. Ava nodded, her trust in her father unwavering. Just promise me you'll be careful. I always am, Samuel replied with a small smile. The next day, Samuel received a call from Lisa. Sir, I found something interesting. The officer in charge of the K-9 program retired suddenly last year. Since then, the program's been poorly managed. There's no proper oversight, and many of the handlers, including Officer Miller, don't have the training they need. Samuel's jaw tightened. This was the kind of information he needed. Good work, Lisa. Keep digging. As the pieces of the puzzle started coming together, Samuel knew he was getting closer to the truth. But he also knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There would be resistance, and not everyone would want the truth to come out. Still, he wasn't backing down. This was about Ava, and about ensuring that no one else would suffer because of the system's failures. Samuel Harris was ready for the fight ahead. As the days passed, Samuel Harris' investigation into the police department's K-9 unit began to gain momentum. The information his assistant, Lisa, uncovered was damning. Reports revealed that the K-9 program had been operating without proper oversight for years. Training budgets had been slashed, and inexperienced officers like Craig Miller had been given control of highly trained animals without the skills to handle them. Samuel compiled the evidence into a detailed report. He knew this wasn't just about Ava anymore. It was about a system that had failed to protect the people it served. His FBI experience taught him to look for patterns, and what he found pointed to a long history of neglect and poor leadership within the department. Meanwhile, word of Ava's case spread throughout the town. Local newspapers and radio stations picked up the story, framing it as a failure of accountability within the police force. People began to rally behind Ava and Samuel, seeing them as symbols of resilience and justice. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForAva, and more witnesses and former victims of the K-9 program started coming forward. One of those witnesses, a man named Joe, reached out to Samuel. Joe had been bitten by a K-9 2 years earlier during a misunderstanding in a traffic stop. His complaint had been dismissed, and he was even made to feel as though it was his fault. Now he was ready to speak out. "I thought I was the only one," Joe told Samuel during a meeting. "But now I see it's a bigger problem. I'm not surprised it happened again." Samuel reassured him. "Your story matters, Joe. Every voice adds weight to this. We're going to make sure they listen this time." Samuel also contacted legal experts and advocacy groups, building a coalition of support. Together, they planned a public forum where victims could share their experiences and demand reform. The event was scheduled to take place in the town hall, and the turnout was expected to be large. At the hospital, Ava was beginning to recover her strength. She watched the growing movement with a mix of pride and unease. "You're turning this into something big, Dad," she said one afternoon as they watched the news together. A segment about the upcoming forum was playing, showing images of people holding signs and calling for accountability. "It needs to be big," Samuel replied. "This isn't just about you, Ava. It's about preventing this from happening to anyone else." Ava nodded, her resolve growing. "I want to be part of it. When I'm strong enough, I'll speak at the forum too." Samuel smiled, proud of her courage. "You've always been strong, Ava. I know you'll make a difference." The day of the forum arrived, and the town hall was packed. People of all ages and backgrounds filled the room, their voices united in a call for change. Samuel took the stage and presented his findings, laying out the evidence with clarity and precision. He spoke not just as an FBI agent, but as a father determined to protect his daughter and his community. As he stepped down, applause erupted, and Ava watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with gratitude. Samuel had turned a moment of pain into a movement for justice, and the tide was beginning to turn. But they both knew the fight was far from over. Real change would take time, and they were ready to see it through to the end. The town hall was buzzing with energy after the forum, and the momentum for justice continued to grow. Ava, now strong enough to leave the hospital, decided it was time to join the movement her father had built. Her injuries were healing, but her spirit had always been unbroken. She knew her voice would add weight to the call for accountability. The next morning, Samuel helped Ava prepare for a televised interview. It was her first public appearance since the attack, and she wanted to make it count. Sitting in the living room, Ava went over her notes while Samuel watched her with pride. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "Not really," Ava replied. "I've faced tougher situations, but this feels personal. It's not just about me. It's about fixing something that's been broken for a long time. Samuel nodded. That's exactly why your voice matters. Just speak your truth. People will listen. The interview took place in a local studio. Ava sat across from a seasoned journalist who had been following the case closely. The cameras rolled, and Ava spoke with clarity and conviction about what had happened to her, how it could have been prevented, and why change was necessary. When the K-9 attacked me, Ava explained, I wasn't just a jogger in the park. I was someone's daughter, a military officer, and a member of this community. That attack could have been avoided with proper training and accountability. It's not just about one dog or one officer. It's about making sure the system works for everyone. The journalist asked thoughtful questions, giving Ava the opportunity to share her perspective. Samuel watched from behind the cameras, feeling a swell of pride as his daughter's words resonated with viewers. By the end of the interview, it was clear Ava had made an impact. Later that day, Ava and Samuel attended a community rally organized by local advocacy groups. Hundreds of people gathered in the park where the attack had taken place, holding signs and chanting for justice. Samuel stood on stage, introducing Ava to the crowd. This is my daughter, he said, his voice steady. She's not just a victim. She's a fighter. And she's here to share her story. Ava stepped forward, looking out at the sea of faces. Thank you for being here, she began. What happened to me was painful, but your support has shown me that I'm not alone. Together, we can ensure that no one else has to experience what I did. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ava felt a surge of strength. She spoke about the need for proper training in the K-9 program, for oversight within the police department, and for community voices to be heard. Her words were met with cheers and chants of agreement. As the rally ended, Ava and Samuel were approached by several community leaders who pledged their support. They discussed plans to present a formal proposal to the town council, calling for reforms in the police department and its K-9 unit. That evening, back at home, Ava and Samuel sat on the porch, reflecting on the day's events. We're making progress, Ava said, her voice filled with hope. Samuel smiled. We are. But this is just the beginning. Real change takes time, and we have to keep pushing. Ava nodded. We will. Together. The stars above seemed brighter that night, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could break through. Ava and Samuel were ready to keep fighting, knowing they had the strength of their community behind them. The months that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and action. Ava and Samuel's efforts, combined with the overwhelming support of the community, had brought the issue to the forefront. The town council, under increasing public pressure, scheduled a hearing to discuss reforms within the police department, particularly the K-9 unit. On the day of the hearing, the town hall was packed. Community members filled every seat, while others stood outside holding signs of support. Ava, dressed in her military uniform, sat beside her father at the front. Her presence was a powerful reminder of what had happened and why change was necessary. As the hearing began, Samuel presented the evidence he and his team had gathered: complaints about the K-9 program, reports of inadequate training, and testimonies from witnesses and victims. He spoke with calm authority, laying out the facts clearly and convincingly. This isn't about assigning blame to individuals, Samuel said. It's about addressing the system that has failed to protect the people it's meant to serve. We're here to ensure accountability and create a safer community for everyone. When it was Ava's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She stood and took a deep breath before addressing the council and the audience. I am not here as a victim, she began. I am here as someone who believes in the value of service, integrity, and justice. What happened to me was preventable. It was the result of poor training and a lack of oversight. But instead of focusing on the pain, I want to focus on the opportunity we have to make things better. She spoke about her experience, the fear and vulnerability she felt, and her determination to turn that moment into something meaningful. By the time she finished, There wasn't a dry eye in the room. The council members, visibly moved, promised to take immediate action. In the weeks that followed, changes began to take shape. The police department announced a complete overhaul of the K-9 program. New trainers were brought in, and officers handling the dogs were required to undergo rigorous certification. A civilian oversight board was also established to ensure transparency and accountability in future incidents. The community, inspired by Ava and Samuel's fight for justice, remained engaged. Local organizations held workshops and discussions about improving relationships between law enforcement and residents. The movement had grown beyond Ava's case, becoming a catalyst for broader change. One evening, as Ava and Samuel walked through the park where the attack had occurred, they noticed something new. A small plaque had been placed near the trail, dedicated to Ava's courage and the community's efforts to create a safer, more just town. Ava smiled, her hand brushing over the engraved words. "Injustice can only be defeated when we stand together." "I still can't believe how far we've come," Ava said, looking at her father. Samuel nodded, pride evident in his eyes. "You turned your pain into purpose, Ava. That's something few people have the strength to do." As they continued walking, the sun set behind them, casting a warm glow over the park. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Together, they had not only sought justice but had sparked meaningful change, and they both knew their fight for fairness and equality would continue, one step at a time.